Welcome to another episode of the Frostburg Film Society podcast. This is Jake as always. The film that we played was Movie 43, a movie that one of our members was very emphatic, as I've said many times, in playing it, and we'll talk to her in a bit. But first, I thought this would be a really good opportunity to discuss what the vignette film is and sort of the ideas behind it and its origins, really, in a lot of ways. And quite frankly, the origin of vignette films goes back to the very origin of film itself. When film was first invented, you're talking, they were generally about 1 minute reels, shorts, and they would, for public exhibition, they would play multiple films at once. Probably the best well-known example is in 1895, the Lumiere brothers premiered 10 of their short films in Paris in late December. That sort of is the wellspring of where the idea of this stuff came from, and it wasn't done on purpose. It was done out of necessity because reels were not very long. Now, as time went on, your average reel got up to about 15 minutes. But they were still, not necessarily always, but they were still doing sort of what we think of as vignette showcasing now. And in modern context, we showed Four Rooms previously with Quentin Tarantino, and his early works have a lot of vignette influence, right? Vignette is a French term that basically just means a short story, a slice of life, although slice of life is not always represented as a vignette. A vignette is pretty much always a slice of life. There's not necessarily a big driven plot. Sometimes there are themes and threads, so to speak, that are interwoven. So, like Four Rooms, the narrative that drives the entire piece is the bellboy, the Tim Roth character, who has to go and tend to the needs of the guests inside the hotel. This week's film, Movie 43, the thread or the narrative that ties everything together is this guy pitching these film ideas to a studio as it goes terribly off the rails. There are a lot of things about this film that are very interesting that we'll discuss with Mary in a bit, including the amazing cast, the kind of filmmakers behind this. But what really strikes me, it's I love genre cinema. It is my favorite thing. I really enjoy comedy. I specialize a bit more in horror, and my education and knowledge of horror film in particular is much deeper. What I find particularly interesting, I think comedic acting is probably the most difficult form of acting. If you can pull off comedy, you can probably pull off drama. And horror is also very difficult. To properly affect somebody is not easy. And to me, and I'm sure there are people that will disagree and will take exception to this, but when it comes to the vignette format, I always felt comedy was easier to achieve than horror vignettes. And there are plenty of examples of both. This month we focused on comedy vignettes. And, again, it's always a mixed bag. Some of them are awesome, some of them are less so. I think generally what happens is the ones that are really great and stand out, well, they tend to overshadow the ones that aren't quite as powerful and don't pack quite the punch. And horror vignettes are no different. It's also true there, but I also think with the limited time and the style of narrative that's needed with such a limited format, that horror is harder to pull off. We could talk about examples of those type of vignettes. There's ABCs of Death 1 and 2. There's the All Hallows Eve series. There is the Creep Show series of films. Twilight Zone is sort of that thing, but they're more anthology one-offs. And that's an interesting idea to discuss as well, is what is the difference between anthology and vignettes. And some people discuss these things as if they're interchangeable. And in some ways, I suppose they are, but for me, I think of vignettes are short stories that are kind of comprised together that may or may not be connected or interwoven. Where an anthology film or series, particularly for television, for the series, each episode of the series is its own self-contained story. Not necessarily the vignette format, because generally vignettes are very short. So something like movie 43, for example, there are over 10 stories that take place in basically 85-90 minutes, where something like Black Mirror, the episodes are roughly about an hour long, and it's a singular story that they're telling within that hour. So it's technical, sure, and there's nuance to that conversation. And I really do love the vignette storytelling. It's a real challenge to self-contain something in that short of a time, and it's also very traditionalist. When you look at what cinema was, let's say, during World War I and II, you would go to a movie theater and you would plan to be there for multiple hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, something like that. And in that time, you paid a penny, 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever. And you would get cartoons and serials, which are basically like episodes of, this is before television, but it's like television episodes with cliffhangers. It's like the Lone Ranger is an example of one. I believe there were Sherlock Holmes, things taken from the radio in that very similar style. And then they would want you to come back next week or next month or whatever to continue that story from that reel. The cartoons, cliffhangers, episodes, newsreels, you would get a series of these things that, here's what's going on in the world, and here's some wacky cartoons for the kids, and here's some cliffhanger narrative things that will keep you coming back. And roughly about that time, a reel was 10 to 15 minutes. You're talking about, depends on the era specifically, right? Because if you're talking about stuff that is pre or not long after the Jazz Singer came out, and what was that, 28, I believe, there was no audio. There was no sound recorded. So a lot of the early stuff they would put on a record, or they would have somebody play a piano. A lot of the Three Stooges stuff, or some of the Charlie Chaplin shorts, Amos and Andy, stuff like that. They would put a couple of those together, and in that is the vignette style. Now, again, it was created by necessity and not as an artistic expression per se as we have in the modern era. Now, when we look at vignettes, these are directly artistic expressions, generally an excuse to have directors collaborate together. And, some folks use it as a competition, and it's very easy to see what rises to the top. There's a really great vignette film called Body Bags, I believe, from the late 80s, early 90s. It's got folks like John Carpenter in it. That is really kind of amazing, that pulls in a lot of great filmmakers together. And this is not to be confused with, there's another series called Masters of Horror. That's an anthology series that's like, each episode's about an hour, and each episode's got its own writer-director, and, a lot of things like Cigarette Burns and Jennifer and Pelts, and a lot of really great stuff comes out of that, and you get a lot of really incredible filmmakers. And you kind of see what they're able to do with a limited budget and so forth. Great shit. I would really encourage people to explore these things, because these are really interesting ideas, and we sort of see these things as novelties now when, it's weird when you think about the early parts of cinema. All of cinema was seen as a novelty until they kind of hit their stride and started creating these beautiful, long, challenging narratives. And I don't mean challenging by content, I just mean intellectually. Vignette as a word is French in origins. And it actually originally was pertaining to literature. You would put these collections of short stories together, and, each one was called a vignette. And we've kind of taken that and added it to cinema. There's also vignetting, which has nothing to do with narrative and everything to do with cinematography. And it's basically when you tone down the lighting, and sometimes you decrease the sharpness around the edges of the image. Photographers use this technique a lot. It creates a lot of tone, and the emotional response is completely different. Anyway, because Mary was so into screening this film for everybody, we're going to go ahead and call her real quick and discuss this with her and have her take on it. And we'll get into some of the filmmakers and actors, because there's a lot of that stuff. There are a lot of things about movie 43 that are very interesting. It took them almost 10 years to make, because nobody wanted to make it, because, well, it's borderline obscene in a lot of ways, in a really great way. When you have a guy like Hugh Jackman, who's played Wolverine for, I don't know, 20 years now or something. He's on a blind date with testicles hanging from his chin. And it is just a wildly constructed film with a lot of wacky ideas. Things like Richard Gere tried to get out of his role and tried to not film this project because he was kind of offended by a lot of its content. There's some of that stuff, and then there's the other side where some of the actors really embraced how ridiculous this thing was. To my understanding, Emma Stone kind of really embraced it. Hey, Mary, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, you're on the podcast right now.
Yeah.
I just gotta. You were really, emphatic is the word that we screened
Yes.
this. And so why?
This is one of my favorite movies. I will say, I think, like, the most quoted, like, sketch, scene, whatever, and, like, because me and my family quote this movie way too often, is, Anna Faris, and it's you sit on a floor, you poop on the one that you love. It's just such a good line, and that scene is incredible. But I hadn't watched it for a couple of years, and then I rewatched it like a couple months ago, and there were so many scenes that I completely forgot. Like the MP3 player one was one that like I had in the back of my mind, and then I'd remember it. I'd be like, oh, that's movie 43. But like the vending machine one, and the copier machine that was just full of children. Like showing the children like crying and terrified while people are like angrily shaking machines. That's incredible. Like it's just peak comedy. It's incredible. And we have talked about Halle Berry's one at the very end.
Yes.
It's so good.
I agree. That one, Beazle the cat, made me laugh really hard, and the Hugh Jackman with balls on his chin.
Yeah.
I thought all of it was so ridiculous and hilarious. Like the kids in the copy machine, it was a little bit. I thought it was kind of weird. Like it didn't quite make me. I was just like, so we're enslaving children. And the Terrence Howard bit at the end, and also I don't. They're not really like the tied together sections at the studio.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of them were really funny, and then other ones were just fucking ridiculous. There was a lot of the whole Richard Gere not understanding why the fan placement wouldn't be good. On the
I think like the one I made a couple people watch after I had rewatched it because I kept quoting it was the one with what's his name? I Burning Out White, right?
Oh, his parents are like trying to give him a normal.
That's another interesting thing. Like it's a lot of like really famous people, like people that have already reached their prime, and then people who are like not quite like young stars.
Yeah, I keep thinking this was pretty early for Common. Yeah, I think White was.
Like what's her face? The girl who gets her period.
Oh yeah,
and even the dude from Superbad.
Oh yeah, I can't remember if Kick-Ass came out. It would have had to have come out before this, because this was 2013. Yeah, just the whole. It's really a mixed bag of like I don't understand how they cast it the way they did. And how, like, I guess at one point Richard Gere tried very hard to get out of the contract to do this movie. Because I guess he was absolutely appalled by what it was.
That makes sense.
But it's also, like, it's kind of wild to look at now with the climate we find ourselves in. But it's crazy that it got made. It took like 10 years almost 10 years to get made.
Yeah.
And the budget was kind of high, but it made money. And this was also when home release was, really sold really well at the time, in terms of like DVDs and shit like that.
Yeah, and what's his face? Why can't I think of his name? The dude from Jackass.
Johnny Knoxville. Oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
and he's paired with Sean William Scott from American Pie. And then they have Gerard Butler, and I keep thinking the other leprechaun is one of the Skarsgård brothers, but I'm not sure because the makeup is heavy.
It's such a good cast, and it's so funny.
Some of it I don't think works. it's a lot like I guess is just the functionality of anthology films, but it really seems like a mixed bag. And I wonder if some of that has to do with when somebody really nails something, like everything else pales to comparison.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think, like, I don't know, I think, like, pretty much
What do you mean? Well, I hadn't, if I'm being honest, until it was on the schedule, I hadn't seen it in a long time. So a lot of it I didn't remember the iBay plot at all. And then I didn't remember the homeschool kid stuff at I didn't remember. I remember the poop because it was so wild, and there were like the balls on the shin, the leprechaun stuff. Like I remembered some of it, but a lot of it I completely forgot. And then when I watched it, I was like, "Oh shit, this is kind of." And then the cast. Just the whole, I'm not into Asian guys, just like, oof. It's so mean at first, like, yeah, man, and you're talking about people like, Bob Odenkirk directed one of the vignettes, Elizabeth Banks directed one, like, there are a lot of really great, James Gunn. This is way before he was involved with Marvel. He was still doing like Slither and like those kind of shock films at the time. I don't remember what year Slither was. But anyway, so this is a childhood movie for you? That's interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't picture this being like having, I don't know, the nostalgia, I guess, they have attached to it. But it makes sense, actually, given your sense of humor. Right on, man. Well, I think we're going to wrap, but thanks for taking part in the podcast as always, Barry. Hey everybody, thanks for hanging out with us on another episode of the Frostburg Film Society podcast. Before we go, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of information. We've just concluded our first month of screenings, which was 4 rooms in movie 43. Next month, we're doing kind of an interesting, which is basically blackballed movies about killers. And we've got 2 really cool ones for June. On June 10th, we're screening Smokin' Aces, which is a Joe Carnahan film that he wrote and directed. I like a lot of Carnahan's stuff. He made, like, The Grey, that wolf movie with Liam Neeson. I really liked that film. He did a remake of The A-Team. It also had Liam Neeson, coincidentally. But I wasn't quite as big a fan of that. But I'm not a big A-Team guy anyway. But June 10th, we'll be screening Smokin' Aces. It's it's interesting because Smokin' Aces is another film that has a huge cast that, for some of them, this was their first film, and so you get to see really like Common and Alicia Keys had not really done film before Smokin' Aces, and then you get other people like Affleck is in this, and just a lot of really cool actors you wouldn't expect. Jeremy Piven plays maybe one of the most emotionally interesting roles he's ever played in his life. But it's really worth a watch. It's really great. It's one of my favorites. And then June 24th, we will be screening the original Boondock Saints. That's the film kind of put Norman Reedus out there. Willem Dafoe plays one of his greatest characters for sure. It's, these films are very funny and very violent and very stylized, which I really love. And they both have really interesting histories of folks trying to blackball them and stop them from production. I'm really looking forward to that. And again, June 10th, Smokin' Aces. June 24th, The Boondock Saints. Entry's always free. And we always start at 6 p.m. in the Hotel Gunter's Speakeasy for these screenings. We just upgraded the system, so we have a much bigger screen. And, movie 43 screening was really excellent. I was really happy with the image, and I was really happy with how it went. Our stuff has never looked better. Projectors are a big upgrade, a big help. I love them. So much so that I got rid of the television in my living room so I could just have a huge projected image in here now. And Film Society is no different. When you discuss and analyze and think about film, it's a medium that is designed to be blown up on a very large screen. They're made to be large images, and we don't think of them that way as much anymore just because, I mean, everybody, a lot of us, myself included, watch movies on their phones, and we've been watching them on television screens for forever. And it's funny because Ty and I have had discussion many times that, like, if you go back, not even necessarily that far, but like from like the mid '80s or something back, prior to VHS and home release, films were not meant to be analyzed and discussed the way that they are. They were not seen as uh, possible for academic intrigue. They were just seen as like, here's the newest goofy fucking whatever. Um, so the films were different earlier on. Now everybody, not everybody, but a lot of folks try to make films to be academically studied, which is sort of a bummer in some ways because they're only, not necessarily everybody, but most folks, they're a small window of possibilities for them to pursue to become academically worthwhile. Which is a shame because I've always thought the experimentation of film was the stuff that was really exciting. You know, but it all depends, I guess, because sometimes I'll see an artsy thing, and geez, I watched the Cremaster cycle, and it really blew me away how interesting, particularly the third section, the order. I thought was really brilliant and interesting. Uh, and had a lot more to say than like, look at me, I'm being artsy. Well, I guess now is the time to, before I go, I always like to throw out a recommendation out there for film. And, this week I watched a film called Stop Motion that I really liked, that I thought was really interesting. It was a horror film, of course, it's me. But it was an interesting horror film. It's about a girl that was trained to make stop motion film, and she feels like she doesn't have her own voice to make them, and her mother is sort of a kind of a little bit of a tyrant that pushes and forces in not the nicest way in the world. And her mother gets ill, and she's got to go this whole route. And psychologically, it's interesting. The ending is particularly interesting, and the device is used. I haven't seen things structured that way, and certain mechanics of it were very interesting. They had some ritualistic stuff that I thought was cool. Um, I like when you see a smaller budget film be bold, like that film is. And I think it's worth a watch. It's streaming on Shutter, I believe. But you could probably, like buy it or rent it on Amazon or whatever. It's really worth a watch. It's really interesting. So until next time, June 10th, again, Smoking Aces screening at 6 p.m., Hotel Gunter Speakeasy. And I want to thank the Carters and the staff here at the Hotel Gunter. They're always very supportive and uh, kind of let us screen and discuss the films that we want, which is awesome. There's that type of freedom here. And, hopefully Film Society continues to grow. Thanks for listening to this, and to everybody that comes to our screenings and so forth. But until the next episode and screening, I'm Jake as always, and have a week.